Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome into the show. It is Tuesday evening, April 14th, 2026. I'm Brian Schott, the publisher and managing editor of Utah Political Watch. You can find us online at utahpolitics.news. That is an independent political news website. No corporate owners, no billionaires, journalist owned, journalist operated. That's me. It's my website. And I'm responsible for everything that you see on there. I'm supported 100% by my readers, and that's the best way to do this sort of thing because that's who I'm accountable to. I'm not accountable to corporations. I'm not accountable to billionaires. I'm not accountable to people living out of state. I'm accountable to my actual consumers. Just notice my hair is really messed up over here. Apologize for that. Anyway, we've got a lot to talk about tonight, so I'll be letting everybody make their way into the chat. If you have something you want to bring up, feel free to leave your comments in the chat, and we will get to them as soon as possible. I'm not sure why we're not seeing a live stream over here on TikTok. I got to look at just a couple of things, make sure everything is running correctly. There we go. That's working on Instagram. Gotta make sure I'm getting the signal on TikTok. There we go. All right, everything seems to be working now. So, welcome into the show. If you want to talk about anything, if you have any questions, comments, please leave them in the chat and we'll get to them as soon as possible. I will tell you that I've got a lot on my list tonight, including Senator Mike Lee's Supreme Court dreams could finally be coming true. I published a story today. I don't know if you saw it, but Senator Chuck Grassley, who is approximately 4 billion years old and still in the Senate, and apparently the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, there are rumors that Samuel Alito is getting ready to step down from the court. The main thing that got this started is he has a brand new book coming out. That is the day after the court starts their next term in October. And that's highly unusual. So anyway, there's speculation that Samuel Alito could be stepping down, and Chuck Grassley was asked about that today. He said he would like Samuel Alito to stay in his position, but if he steps down, he plans to recommend to the White House that they nominate either Senator Lee or Texas Senator Ted Cruz. So that could be happening. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about what happened at the Salt Lake County Democratic Convention over the weekend. Kathleen Reeby drops out of the Congressional District 1 race and endorses Ben McAdams, takes a shot at Nate Bluin. On the way out, she's now an advisor on McAdams' campaign. Also, a lot of people have been talking about they're hearing that Ben McAdams is funded by AIPAC. I'll break that down for you. It's not exactly true. That's not exactly the truth. People are connecting some dots and hoping that you won't actually look into it. But it's not exactly true. Ben McAdams is not taking a ton of money from AIPAC. We'll talk about that a little bit this evening. Also on the list, the Republicans. They've got their state convention coming up in 2 weeks. Remember, they have this rule on the books that says you have to be a registered Republican for a year before you run for a state office. The Salt Lake County Republican Party said, that rule doesn't apply to us because it might take out one of the candidates that we like for state school board. So we're not going to follow that rule. But at the state level, the Republicans used it to knock out a congressional candidate in the 3rd congressional district. We can talk a little bit about fundraising as well. The FEC fundraising numbers are in, and I've been going over those a little bit. I don't have a complete breakdown, but I can tell you some things that jumped out about that for me as well. I do want to talk a little bit about Utah Valley University. They've invited Sharon McMahon as their speaker for graduation, and conservatives, led by Senator Mike Lee, of course, a few other people, are very hopping mad that they have invited her to be the commencement speaker because she committed the heinous crime of accurately quoting Charlie Kirk after he was shot and killed on campus. they're attempting to bully UVU into dropping her as a commencement speaker. So far, it's not working. Surprisingly, they haven't caved on that yet. They might, but so far they haven't. So we can talk about that. Plus anything else that's on your mind tonight. So feel free to leave your comments in the chat. I will get to them throughout the evening. But we do have a lot to talk about. You can see all of my social handles on the screen. They're rotating. Give me a follow there. Give me a follow on whatever platform you're watching this on tonight. That just helps. That helps me out as an independent journalist, as someone who is depending on my readers to continue doing what I'm doing. Because as I said, I'm an independent journalist. I don't have corporate ownership. There's no billionaire telling me what to do. You can also go to my website, utahpolitics.news, and subscribe. Most of my journalism is free, so you can sign up for free. But if you do want to become a subscriber for $5 a month, you get some extras. The latest thing that I did that was an extra for subscribers, and I'm pretty proud of it. I rated all 75 House races and 15 Senate races that will be on the ballot in 2026. And there's a few that could be competitive. So anyway, that is something, those ratings are an exclusive for my subscribers, $5 a month, which is like, 17 cents a day or something. I'm not great at math. That's why I'm a journalist. But anyway, a lot of stuff to talk about tonight. So we will get to that as soon as possible. Again, leave your questions and comments in the chat, and I will try to get to that as soon as possible. Gabriel on YouTube says, I thought the Mike Lee types were super upset about bullying people into silence on college campuses. They're upset about them being bullied into silence. They are perfectly fine with bullying others into silence. And they're still mad that this Charlie Kirk thing did not turn into a huge national movement. There were desperate attempts by those on the right to turn Kirk into a sort of right-wing martyr. And it really feels like conservatives overplayed their hand. They punished people for being insufficiently mournful of Charlie Kirk, who said some pretty problematic things. And I've said this before. I am sad. I'm upset that he was killed. I don't think anybody should have to die like that. But I'm not going to pretend that I agreed with the things that he said. And some of the things that he said I found really offensive. But that's who he was. That's how he made his money. He went on college campuses, and he was a guy who made his living going on college campuses and debating 18-year-olds, much like Ben Shapiro. That's what he did. But UVU invited Sharon McMahon to their campus, and people are upset because they think that it's a slap in the face to the memory of Charlie Kirk. One of the things I've been thinking about is the Republicans are having their state convention at UVU. I'm putting the over-under on mentions of Charlie Kirk during that event at probably 300. It's going to be a constant drumbeat about Charlie Kirk. I expect that to happen. So, no judgment, but that's probably going to be the centerpiece of their convention that's coming up in 2 weeks. Let's see. Spencer Wins on YouTube says, Lee and Cruz are the two senators most hated by their colleagues, so I'm sure they'd sail through confirmation and right onto the court. There was actually a story in Puck News a couple of weeks ago that said Senator Lee is the most despised member of the Senate. And if he got nominated, this was when the speculation was that he might get nominated for Attorney General to replace Pam Bondi. But there was one Senate aide joked that he would be a unanimous confirmation because they just want to get rid of him. They want him out. R. Callum on Instagram says, state delegate here. I'll try and keep a tally of Kirk mentions if I remember. I'm planning on being there. I'm planning on going to the Republican convention. I have to make a choice between the Republican convention and the Democratic convention. And I think the Republican convention is going to be more interesting because we already know that we're going to have a primary in the Democratic race in CD1. Ben McAdams and Nate Bluen have both collected enough signatures to qualify. So there's not a lot of drama at the state convention. So I'll be watching. So I'm planning on going to the Republican convention. Speaking of conventions, this Saturday, I am planning on attending the Davis County Republican Convention because I think that there's some interesting things that could happen there. That's the one that got my attention, so I'm going to head up there. And as common courtesy, I always let them know that I'm going to be coming to be at their convention. I don't think it's fair play for me to just show up out of nowhere and cover their convention. I could, but I think it's common courtesy. So I let them know that I would be coming. And a little birdie has told me that there's been some chatter among leaders of the Davis County Republican Party that they are, quote unquote, very nervous that I'm showing up. Little old me? They're scared of me? Just because I tend to write mean things about them at these conventions. But they're very aware that I'm going to be there, and they're very nervous that I'm going to show up. I'm going to show up anyway. Dave Calder asks, can you explain a little bit about your methodology determining ratings for Utah House and Senate races? Sure. And that is my race ratings, which are subscriber only. So I'm not going to bring it up on the screen here tonight, but I can explain this for you. What I did was I created two ratings. And let me pull them up so I can talk a little bit more accurately about what they are. But I created two ratings. Each race gets two ratings. The first one is the likely outcome. And the likely outcome race is based on partisan data. I considered 8 statewide elections going back to 2012, usually the presidential race. And I was able to map those more or less, as closely as I can. Precinct lines change, things change, but as accurately as I could, I mapped those results onto the current Senate and House districts. And so the first rating is the likely outcome, and that just measures the straight up political, the partisan lean of every House district, every House and Senate districts. So that's the first rating that everyone gets, okay? So the first one is the likely outcome. It's the historical two-party vote share in a district. And there's safe Republican, safe Democrat, likely Republican, lean Republican and Democrat, and toss-up, okay? If you, for instance, a district that's rated lean Republican is one where a Republican would win, but the margins are tighter than usual, okay? Then there's a second rating that I came up with, and this is called the Utah Competitiveness Index. And what that does is it measures a district, how far it is off of the statewide baseline of a Republican vote of 64.5%. That's essentially the baseline in any district for the Republican candidate, or the statewide baseline is 64.5%. The average Utah legislative district votes about 65% Republican in a two-party race. So the UCI tells you which districts are competitive by Utah standards. So you could have a district with a low UCI, the Utah Competitiveness Index, but it can still be favoring one party or the other. It can still be favoring the Republicans because it's more Democratic than the typical district, but it's still a Republican district. The easiest way to think about it is likely outcome is a measure of who is probably going to win in November, and UCI gives you an idea of which races are worth watching. if that makes any sense. So that is how those ratings work. So for instance, let's talk a little about the Senate ratings. Right now, I think there's only, according to my ratings, there's only 2 districts that could be competitive. I'm not saying they're going to be competitive, but they could be competitive. Senate District 5, that is the district that's being vacated by Ann Milner. That one could be competitive. I've got it rated as lean Republican, but the competitiveness index is R plus 1.2, meaning it is more Democratic than the Republican baseline of 64.5%. So the UCI actually says that that's a toss-up, but it's lean Republican. That one could be competitive. Now, it's all going to come down to candidate quality, fundraising is going to be a big deal, campaign quality, things along those lines. I mean, you're not just going to be able to roll in and win this. But that's the first one that I think could be competitive. The other one is Senate District 19, which is Senator Kirk Cullimore's seat. That one could also be competitive according to these ratings. It is lean R, but the Utah Competitiveness Index is R plus 0.8. So it's a much more Democratic district when compared to the rest of the state, when compared to the Republican baseline, again, of 64.5%. So that's how that works. Those numbers are available to Utah Political Watch subscribers for $5 a month. Actually, I'm going to be changing that here in about a week or so. What I'm going to be doing is I'm going to make it so those will only be available for annual subscribers because I put a lot of work into these. But yeah, so that's how it works. Gabriel on YouTube asks, do early indications of a Democratic wave interact with your ratings, or since they're based on past elections, they don't interact with the current political climate? No, there's really no way for me to factor in a political wave. I'm sure that I'm trying to figure out if there's a way that I can say, if we see a national shift of X towards the Democrats, what would that do here? Because I think that if what we're seeing nationwide, if there's a backlash against Republicans, and I think the one thing here in Utah that could lead to that backlash is Senate Bill 153, which is making people's voter information public. Lawmakers passed that this year. A lot of people were not paying attention when that got passed. But now that people know what is coming, they are mad. People are hot about this. That's the kind of thing that could lead to a backlash against Republicans. Easily. So, that's the kind of thing that could push these ratings one way or another. And that's why I think it's important to look at which ratings could be competitive. Again, you're going to look at candidate quality, you're going to look at fundraising. For instance, I can talk a little bit about this. I'm not going to show it on screen. But one of the things that I really agonized over was House District 16. That's Trevor Lee's seat. Now, if you look at my ratings, it's safe Republican, but the competitiveness index has it as R plus 2.9. And the reason for that is because Trevor Lee has been a very weak candidate at the polls, and he is wildly unpopular in that district. If you remember, when he first won the nomination in 2022, Steve Handy launched a write-in campaign against him, got over 4,000 votes, got really close. I mean, he came within about 1,500 write-in votes of Trevor Lee in the November election. That really skewed these results a bit. So it's still safe Republican. That district is going to elect a Republican. But the competitiveness index means it's more Democratic simply because of Trevor Lee's political weakness. I took a lot. That was really, I had a hard time wrapping my head around how to rate that. But when it comes down to it, Trevor Lee's performance at the ballot box has not been great. And that's why the Republican nomination in that district is so important. Because whoever wins the Republican nomination is likely to win in November. So that's how those ratings work. but I haven't had figured out a way to do an indication. I'm gonna try to see if there's a way that I can plug in. We've been seeing a Democratic overperformance everywhere in these special elections after Trump was reelected, and now how unpopular he's becoming. And so I'm going to see what that might do, but that'll be for a future update. I'm also trying to figure out how to put fundraising numbers in, and I'll have to figure out a metric to measure those and figure out a way to incorporate those into the ratings. But that's what I'm working on. But thank you for the questions. Thank you for the input. Elliot Nutter on Facebook says, I've seen 2 people on Instagram and Facebook complain about the public voter rolls. I think it's going to come back to bite folks, especially Trevor Lee. Color me surprised he might get some pushback. If people were not really paying attention when this was making its way through the legislature, I talked about it, but I think people really didn't understand what the real world impact is. And now that it's hitting, they're mad. People are really hot about this, like I said. And this is the kind of thing that could cause a backlash. And I don't think it helps Trevor Lee to have his name as the floor sponsor. He wasn't the main sponsor. The main sponsor is John Johnson, who is not up for election this year. But as I wrote a couple of weeks ago, this bill was basically inspired by election conspiracy theorists. Because when people were trying to compare or trying to investigate the elections, trying to look at the election results, right? What they were doing was they would look at a precinct or a legislative district or whatever and look at the number of votes, and then they try to compare it to the voter rolls. And if some people have their information private, it looks like there are more votes than voters. This is something that Phil Lyman was never able to wrap his head around. And I had multiple conversations with him with this, that there is some information that he could not get his hands on the voter rolls. And he thought it was so-called phantom voters who don't exist. And then layer on top of that the mail-in voting and people claiming that people are getting 20 ballots for people who don't live at this address anymore and they're voting. Like, none of that is actually happening in any major numbers. But you take the fact that there's about 300,000 voters in the state that have their information marked as private. Nobody can see it. Nobody can see their registration numbers. And then you look at the election results, and in some places it looks like there are more votes than voters. And then you lay on top of it the mail-in balloting. People who I would say are prone to believing conspiracy theories are going to be a little bit suspicious of this. And that's the main thing that has driven this whole thing about making your voter information public. That's where this all comes from. And like I said, people are really mad. SJ on TikTok says, I'm switching to independent. I feel this is meant to target minorities and the left. Your information is still going to be public, though. Some people can go and try to get it redacted. I went down to the county clerk today and turned in the form asking to keep my information private because under the law, there's a carve out for public figures who have received a threat. And I have been threatened. I've been threatened in person at my house. I received threats through the mail. So I put that in. I filled out that form. John Mister on TikTok says, as a mailman, the attacks on vote by mail are so frustrating, baseless, garbage, and vindictive. Yeah, everybody was fine with vote by mail until Donald Trump lost one election. Everybody was absolutely fine with vote by mail until that happened. Funny how that works, huh? Funny how that works. So, if you have any questions or comments, you want to talk about that some questions, leave them in the chat and I will get to them as quickly as possible. SJ says, I'm a public figure. I'll be doing that too. Yes, if you can keep your stuff private, you absolutely should, but you need to fill out the form. I think it's online go to vote.utah.gov and you can find it, and then download the form and take it into your county clerk. Jaster says, how is it? My friend and I both just got our letters and I opened TikTok and we're talking about it. This is a big deal for voters. I think people did not understand the impact, how this was going to impact them. Now, one of the things the law does is you're going to get a new voter ID number. So, people aren't going to be able to go back and connect you to the new voter information. But it's still going to be out there. It's not going to be like publicly available to everyone, like I explained in our last week. This all started back, I believe, in 2000 and, I probably just need to pull up that article. But this all started when somebody, here, I'll get the numbers. Back in 2014, what happened was, back in 2014, a guy from New Hampshire bought the entire state voter roll and posted it online, like everything. It had names, it had addresses, phone numbers, birth dates, the whole thing. Just posted it online, and legislators freaked out. So they tightened who could buy the voter roll. So people can still go and buy a copy of the voter roll. I think it's $1,050, but it's limited to a number. It's limited to who can buy it. You can't buy it for commercial purposes. So like people who are telemarketers, sales, data brokers, they're not going to be able to buy that. It can only be bought for academic purposes, political purposes, and there's a couple of others, research, journalistic. So that's who can buy the voter roll. As I said, I have access to the voter roll through a company called L2. They provide the voter day database, a Utah day database, to me, and I can look up if somebody is registered, what political party they are, and which elections they voted in. I can see that, but I can't see if it's private. That's all going to change in May when pretty much everybody's information becomes public. Jaster says, I would love to know, can potential employers access? No, they can't, unless they get it through a campaign, which there are some controls there. So no, it's not like everybody's going to be able to go buy your information, but it will be available. It'll be available to political parties. It'll be available to researchers. Mostly it's political parties who will use this stuff. Now, the company L2, they're able to match a lot of other information. They have other databases. I don't have access to that because that's how they make their money. And I think, and I can understand why they wouldn't let me just root around in there, but they've got consumer information and they know a lot about the voters here in the state. But more people are going to have that information out there. So what happened was, that was in 2014. Somebody bought the voter roll, posted online, lawmakers freaked out. 3 years later, in 2017, they passed the current law, which allowed people to make their voter information private for any reason. Previously, you had to have like a court order, domestic violence, stalking, something like that. But this said anybody could request to make their voter information private for any reason. That was in 2017. That is the situation we are under until they passed SB 153 this year. A couple of years later, in 2020, political parties complained that they could not operate correctly because there were private voter information records. They needed that information. And so the legislature passed another bill that allowed political parties and candidates to get access to those voter rolls that are marked private. But they can only be used for a certain number of things. And that was in 2020. But now, after Donald Trump lost the 2020 election, fair and square, there's been an assault on our voter records. And that is what led us to the passage of SB 153. You can draw a straight line from Donald Trump's loss to Phil Lyman's attempts to repeatedly get his hands on the voter rolls to this bill passing. And like I said, people are mad about it. They're really mad. I think the Lieutenant Governor's office had to come out again today and explain what was going to be out there because people are really flipped out about it. And you know that information is not going to penetrate with a lot of people. So they're not going to be able to see it. They're not going to see this information. All they're going to know is that, hey, my information might be public. And they're mad. And that's the kind of thing that could backfire on Republicans in the legislature. SJ says, could an initiative reverse this? Yes, but you wouldn't be able to get an initiative on the ballot until 2028. That's the earliest that you would be able to get an initiative on the ballot. You have to collect signatures and such. I know people are trying to get the governor to call a special session to repeal the law. I don't think that that's going to happen. But that information's out there, and it's going to be, and even more of it is going to be available starting in May. And that's how we got to this point. Okay. What else is on the agenda tonight? What else is on your mind? Please leave it in the chat, and we'll get to that as quickly as possible. I wrote a story today. Senator Mike Lee, his name is once again being thrown around as a potential replacement on the United States Supreme Court. There's a lot of chatter that Samuel Alito is getting ready to retire. He has a new book coming out. The publication date is on October 6th of this year. That is one day after the Supreme Court's next term starts, which is really weird timing. That is really odd timing for this sort of thing. Let me take a drink here. But so there's a lot of chatter that Sam Alito is getting ready to retire. He was actually hospitalized for, I believe, some sort of infection last month, and we didn't know about it until a couple of weeks afterwards. But there is some speculation. And so when that happens, you know, there's usually a lot of chatter about Senator Mike Lee, and this time it's no different. Mike Lee has been on every Trump Supreme Court shortlist since he first started running in 2016. He's never been nominated, obviously, but he's been on every shortlist. He came really close to being the nominee after Anthony Kennedy stepped down. Like really close. That's the nomination that went to Brett Kavanaugh. Trump actually interviewed Lee for that position in 2018. And reportedly, Trump decided not to nominate Lee because he was afraid that Lee's opposition to Roe v. Wade, his very public opposition to that, would have made it so he would not be able to be confirmed by the Senate. Then they chose Brett Kavanaugh instead. But I don't think people realize just how close Lee came to being the nominee when Anthony Kennedy stepped down in 2018. Now, he was on the short list when Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away. That's obviously the nomination that went to Amy Coney Barrett, but Lee was in the top three again. So he's made every short list every single time. And now that we're hearing chatter that Justice Alito might be stepping down, Lee is once again being talked about. In fact, today, Senator Chuck Grassley was asked by Bloomberg Law about the possibility that that Alito could step down. And Grassley said, you know, he hopes that Alito doesn't step down, but if he does, he plans to pitch the White House on either nominating Senator Lee or Texas Senator Ted Cruz. That's who Chuck Grassley, who again is 4.5 billion years old. But that's who he plans on pitching to the White House. What's the White House going to do? I don't know. But Lee, again, has been on every short list since 2016. In fact, last summer, there was a report that the White House was starting to game plan for possibly two vacancies, Alito and Clarence Thomas. Alito is 76 years old. Clarence Thomas is 77. And they were game planning, and Lee, again, was in the mix as a possible nominee for both of them. So expect this to continue. And as we all know, this is a seat that Mike Lee covets. He would love to be on the Supreme Court. And as I said earlier, there was a report in Puck News, I believe last week, that said Lee was the most despised member of the Senate. Now, this was in relation to his name being floated for as a possible replacement as Attorney General for Pam Bondi. Lee was actually on the short list for Attorney General when Trump was elected the second time. Obviously, he didn't get that position. They first offered it to, what's his name? The guy out of Florida. I'm totally spacing his name. Anyway, it went to Pam Bondi. And so, but Lee was on the short list there. And then he was again being talked about for the Supreme Court for Attorney General when Pam Bondi was fired. And Puck News said that Lee was the most despised member of the Senate because, he's just rubbing his colleagues the wrong way, especially with all of his constant harping on passing the SAVE Act. In public, he's talking about how they need to do a talking filibuster, but behind the scenes, Lee has no plan on how he would do that. I think he just likes the attention. A lot of them think he's trying to position himself to be a Supreme Court nominee for Trump. But one Senate aide joked that if Lee were to be nominated, it would be a unanimous confirmation vote because they want to get rid of him. They want him out. Matt Gaetz, thank you. Gabriel on YouTube said it was Matt Gaetz. That's who was first nominated to be Attorney General by Trump, and then it went to Pam Bondi. Miss Cat on YouTube says, what makes Mike Lee remotely qualified for the Supreme Court? I've always been confused by that. When he was in private practice, he worked for the private firm Sidley Austin, and he worked on appellate and Supreme Court litigation. His father was the Solicitor General for the United States in the Reagan administration, meaning when Ronald Reagan was president, Mike Lee's dad was the lawyer who argued in front of the Supreme Court for the administration. And that's where a lot of this started. But Mike Lee's dad was the Solicitor General for the United States under President Reagan. Lee then went to BYU Law School. He clerked for Alito twice. He was a clerk for Alito when Alito was on the 3rd District Court of Appeals. And then after Alito was tapped to the Supreme Court, he went and clerked for him again. And I believe Mike Lee's son has now clerked for Alito as well. Spencer on YouTube says, you guys are asking what qualifies him. Trump's ambassador to Portugal is a car dealer. The Secretary of Defense was previously a Fox Weekend talk show host. Very good points. Very good points. Nathan Detroit on Twitch says, if Lee does get put on the bench, my rose-colored glasses pie-in-the-sky dream scenario would be a Democratic president in Congress, adding 4 liberal justices in 2029, and Lee spending the rest of his life tenure raging against the dying of the MAGA light in furious dissents. I don't know if he can. Let's play pretend for a second. Lee gets on the Supreme Court. I think it's gonna be really hard to be more disliked by your colleagues than Brett Kavanaugh is. Jay Willis over at Balls and Strikes had a great article this week. And again, if you want to read about the Supreme Court, if you want some entertaining coverage about the Supreme Court, go to ballsandstrikes.org. Jay Willis does a great job there. But he was talking about how Justice Sonia Sotomayor took a shot, took a swipe at Kavanaugh at a public event this week. And that almost never happens. It was actually a couple of weeks ago. She was at a public event and she took a swipe at Kavanaugh, which never happens. I mean, they are there are rules of decorum with the Supreme Court. So I think it would be really hard to be more disliked by your colleagues than Justice Kavanaugh, but who knows? Maybe that will happen. Sherry SLC on YouTube says, Mike Lee thinks of himself as a constitutional scholar. The thing about Mike Lee, and he loves to wave his pocket constitution around, it's a John Birch Society. It's basically the modern iteration of the John Birch Society. That's the Constitution that he's waving around. His pocket Constitution is a little problematic because it's produced by a right-wing organization that is related to the John Birch Society, which is unsurprising. But that's the pocket Constitution he loves to wave around. Gabriel says, what about the timeline? Supposing Alito steps down in the next few months, how quickly can the Senate really get a nomination confirmed? I think if they have set their mind to it, it wouldn't take long because this is not something that could be filibustered. I think it would take a couple of months. I think that's what happened with Kavanaugh. This just requires a majority vote on the Judiciary Committee, and then a majority vote in the Senate. And Republicans have the votes to do both. Although Lee is on the Judiciary Committee, and he would obviously have to recuse himself, so maybe there's a tie vote there, but maybe you'll get one of the Democrats to flip. But I don't think it would take long. I'm sure that they would get him. Nathan Detroit says they got Barrett confirmed in less than a month. Ginsburg died in October 2020. Yeah, if they want to get it through, they will do it. And then, as I've talked about before, Utah's process for replacing a senator who steps down, who resigns, who cannot fill out the rest of their term, it's a little bit different than what you'll see in other states. In a lot of other states, it's just up to the governor. The governor appoints a replacement until they can hold a special election. In Utah, the law used to say that it was up to the Central Committee of whichever party that senator belonged to, and they would send 3 names to the governor, and then the governor would pick a replacement. But the legislature changed that rule during the latter years of Orrin Hatch's time in office, when Orrin Hatch his health was failing, and they were worried that he might not be able to finish out his term. And so what happened was they changed the law. So it's no longer the state Central Committee of the Republican Party who would offer up the nominations to replace Lee in the Senate, to be appointed to replace Lee in the Senate. It would be the legislature, not the Utah Senate, not the Utah House, the entire legislature. They would have to come up with 3 names, 3 Republican nominees to send to the governor. And if you can imagine the knife fight that will happen at the legislature to be one of those 3 nominees to replace Senator Mike Lee, should he step down, should he be nominated for the Supreme Court, that is going to be one of the most titanic political battles in the state, because there are a lot of Republicans who would very much like to replace Mike Lee in the Senate, not only in the legislature, but outside of the legislature. And there'll only be 3 names. That's how it would work. So let's see. Anything else on your minds? We will leave your questions in the chat, and we can get to those. A few other things to talk about. Let's talk about what happened at the Salt Lake Democratic Convention on Saturday. Kathleen Reby, who's been struggling in the polls, struggling to raise money, she dropped out of the race on Saturday and endorsed Ben McAdams over Nate Bluin. And this, I think this alters the race in a couple of ways. Obviously, it gets someone who is pulling from the same pool of voters that Ben McAdams is. It gets them out of the race and on his side. Now, I'm not saying that all of her support is going to go to McAdams, but probably a big chunk of it will go to McAdams. Meanwhile, a progressive problem. Right now, Bluin and McAdams are the only people in the race who have qualified for the primary. They've turned in enough signatures. The deadline for them to turn in the rest of the candidates to turn in their signatures was on Friday. Those signatures are being validated as we speak. We should probably know by the end of the week, early next week, if any of the other congressional candidates were able to turn in signatures. And obviously, there's a possibility that any of the other candidates could advance to the primary through the state convention, which will be on April 25th. But Bluin, if say Eva Lopez Chavez or Liban Mohammed or Luis Villarreal, if any of those advance into the primary, and the sense that I get is the most likely are probably Lopez Chavez or Mohammed, that's a problem for Bluin, because they could fracture some of the progressive vote. And the other wild card in this race is it's not just Democrats who are going to be voting on this. Any voter in Salt Lake County, the Democratic primary is open, so any voter in Salt Lake County can vote in this primary. Democrats, independents, even Republicans, as long as they don't vote in another primary. You have to request which ballot you want to get. So, right now it's McAdams and Bluin who are going to be on the primary ballot. It's possible that Mohammed will get enough signatures. It's possible that Chavez will get enough signatures, and it's possible that any of the other candidates will get through in convention. And I think that that's going to be fascinating to see how that plays out, because I think that Bluin would very much like some of the other candidates to drop out and get behind him, and I don't think that they will. Unless it becomes overwhelmingly obvious to them that they are not going to win. That's what happened with Derek Kitchen. That's why he withdrew from the race. That's what happened with Rebbie. She talked about how she was really struggling with fundraising, and she's falling far behind with in that, and doing and putting a lot of her own money towards it, and she just couldn't continue to finance the campaign. And that's why she dropped out. Now, one of the things that I found interesting is when she dropped out and endorsed McAdams, she took a shot at Nate Bluin. She told me one of the reasons why she was dropping out is because she pointed at Bluin's temperament. Her quote to me was, "I didn't want someone who will be volatile and confrontational. That's too much of a risk." She talks about how, Bluin likes to mix things up online, how Bluin likes to be provocative on social media, how he likes to be provocative to the Republicans in the legislature. That's one of the reasons why Nate Bluin has not passed any legislation since he's been in the legislature, because he rubs Republicans the wrong way. And when you've got a Republican supermajority, you're going to need Republican support to get something through. But Bluin wears that like a badge of honor. And that's probably where a lot of his support and a lot of his that's where a lot of his support comes from, and what his supporters like. But for Rebbie, she doesn't like that. She had the line on stage when she announced that she was dropping out and endorsing McAdams. Her line was, "Tweeting is not leading." I mistakenly said, I thought it was preening is not leading, but there was a whole bunch of stuff going on at that time, and I didn't hear it correctly. I had to go back and listen to the tape. But you can expect this race to get a little sharper as it goes on, because both McAdams and Bluin are trying to draw a contrast with each other. They see each other as the main, as their main opponent in this nomination race. And it's going to get sharper because the winner of this nomination is more than likely going to go on and win in November. That's why they're starting to trade shots. McAdams has been focusing on Bluin's inability to pass legislation. On Saturday, his quote was, "Being progressive has to mean making progress. You can believe every right thing. You can give every right speech. You can still go to Washington and not change a damn thing." And another pointed shot that McAdams had was, "I didn't go to Congress to have a job. I went to Congress to do the job." Now, Bluin has hit back against McAdams, saying that one of his attacks on McAdams is when he voted against a Democratic-sponsored resolution in 2020 that would have limited Donald Trump, during his first term, limited his ability to take unilateral military action against Iran. There was a drone strike against an Iranian military leader, and the Democrats were going to pass a resolution to limit his ability to do that, and McAdams voted against that. And that was probably one of the sharpest attacks that Bluin had against McAdams. He said, quote, "We can't settle for a candidate that voted to give Trump more power to wage war against Iran. Our new district went to Democrats by 24 points in 2024. That's a wider margin than Kamala Harris won in the state of Massachusetts." I thought it was a pretty sharp attack. So this race is going to get sharper as we go on, as we get closer to the primary. It's not going to be decided at the convention, but I do expect that. And that's where money is going to play a huge role. And McAdams has a lot more money right now than McAdams does, because he's plugged into the national fundraising networks. He's a proven commodity. If you've proven that you've won in the past, if you've proven that you can win elections, that usually brings in donations. And McAdams is going to have a lot of money for this primary fight. That's what he's going to need it. He's not going to have whoever wins the nomination is not going to have a really tough contest in November. So much like on the Republican side, the nomination fight is it for this race, for the most part. I mean, anything can happen, but most likely that's how this will play out. And right now, McAdams has a lot of money. And there are, I've heard that McAdams has already reserved a bunch of television time leading up to the primary, which is to be expected. When McAdams was running against Mia Love in 2018, Love was running out of money at the end of that race, and McAdams still had a lot of cash. And what happened was McAdams kept buying up a lot of television time. The reason was to keep it away from Mia Love, because TV stations, they have to sell ad time to political candidates. This is the law. Ad time to political candidates at a lower rate than what they sell for normal commercials. So it's a lot of money that goes to TV stations, but not as much as they could make selling a regular commercial. But McAdams has reserved, from what I hear, a lot of television time right before the primary. And what that does is, one, it makes a closing argument in a race as voters are getting ready to go to the polls or send in their ballots. And two, it keeps Bluin from buying those. And Bluin is right now scrambling to come up with as much money. I think McAdams has probably $500,000 more than Bluin does at this point. And as this quote has always stuck with me, as a person who's run political campaigns in the state for years. And I asked him, I said, how much does money play in this? He said, money is the difference between running the kind of campaign that you want to run versus the kind of campaign that you are forced to run. If you have the resources, you can run the campaign you want to run. If you don't have the resources, you have to run the campaign that you are forced to run. And that's how this works out. I had this discussion with a couple of delegates at the convention. And I was happy to go over this with people. But there's a lot of accusations that Ben McAdams is funded by AIPAC, that he takes a lot of money from the pro-Israel lobby. Kinda. There's that website Track AIPAC, and they say that McAdams has received $250,000 from the pro-Israel lobby. They're kind of stretching the numbers there. Here's what really happened. In 2020, 6 years ago, McAdams received a $5,000 donation from, I believe the PAC is called Democratic Majority for Israel. So that is the direct donation that he has taken from the pro-Israel lobby. He has received $5,000. That was in 2020. But then, so what about the other $250,000 that they say? That money, as far as I can tell, and it's really hard to realize this because they don't put a link to their sources. But as far as I can tell, the $250,000 are donations that come to people who also donated to the pro-Israel lobby. That's what, that's where this number comes from. McAdams is not funded by AIPAC. That is a misrepresentation of what actually happened. As far as I can tell, and people will, they don't link to the actual data, and I'm probably going to spend some time digging into this to look at it to see where these numbers come from. But the only direct donation that McAdams has taken from the pro-Israel lobby is a $5,000 donation 6 years ago from a pro-Israel PAC. It wasn't AIPAC, it was another pro-Israel PAC. But he took $5,000 from them. Then he also, apparently, according to this website, Track AIPAC, he took $250,000 from other donors who also have donated to the pro-Israel lobby. That's where those numbers come from. So, it's a number that sounds good. It's a really effective attack, especially with all that's going on right now. But it's just not true. I mean, it's stretching the truth. It's connecting dots that aren't there. And that's where things sit with that. Sorry, I just got a message here and I needed to see what it was. Okay. Sorry, I'm waiting on some news that will break that I think everybody will be interested in. It's a little insidey baseball, but I'm waiting for this to happen tonight. So that's why I'm keeping an eye on my text messages and my email at the same time. But that's where that number comes from. That Ben McAdams is allegedly funded by AIPAC. He's only taken $5,000 directly from the pro-Israel lobby, and that was 6 years ago. Now, the rest of Utah's congressional delegation, especially the 4 current House members, they have taken a lot of direct money from AIPAC. But McAdams, his donation came 6 years ago, and it was $5,000 from a pro-Israel PAC, but not AIPAC. And, accuracy matters when you talk about these sort of things. Kathy on YouTube says, McAdams didn't support Rebbie when she was running, so it's interesting that she is so supportive of him. Well, she didn't support him because she was running against him. You're not going to support someone that you're running against. Rebbie just realized that there was no path to victory for her. JK7771 on YouTube says, strange for Rebbie to complain about rabble-rousing. I feel like if Democrats in the state were more rabble-rousing, there would be more attention on the rampant corruption of Utah Republicans. That can only go so far. That can really only go so far because, again, with a Republican supermajority, Democrats will not pass anything unless they get the support of the Republicans. Nothing up there sponsored by a Democrat passes unless the Republicans want it to pass. And that's pretty much the truth of the matter. Now their projects get funded, but if you upset the Republicans enough, they're not going to give you money to fund your initiatives, your requests for appropriations. So you can rabble rouse a lot. You can rabble rouse, but at some point, it's going to end up hurting your constituents because all of these legislators, and I'm not defending, this is the reality of the situation. All of these legislators have constituents who want them to pass things, who want them to do things for them. And if you just say no all the time, it's going to be really hard to get that done. Kathy says, in 2023, when she ran against Chris Stewart, I think McAdams endorsed her during that race. I'll have to look at that. McAdams wasn't in that race, though. Sherry says, what about Michael Farrell? I don't really know enough about Michael Farrell. I haven't had a chance to look into his platform. And so I apologize. He's got about, right now, according to the latest signature numbers, he's about 2,300 signatures. It's probably a long shot that he's going to make it onto the ballot, but he could. Again, the deadline was last week. But again, I don't know a lot about him and his policies, so I don't know what kind of impact he's going to have. The problem is, at this point in the race, it's going to be this kind of race is going to be name recognition. When you're running for a seat, any seat, you either have name recognition or you spend the money to get name recognition. You have to do one of the two things. McAdams right now has name recognition. Bluin has name recognition. The other candidates don't have a lot of name recognition. And right now, I don't think they have the resources to do that. And they're focused on delegates, but if any of them, because they need them to get through to the primary. But once you get through to the primary, that's, a sprint to the end from April 25th to June 23rd, about 2 months. 8-week sprint. There's not a lot of time to introduce yourself to voters in that space. So that's where things sit. Let me see what else is on my list for tonight. And again, if you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the chat and we will get to those. Let's see. I'm trying to go back through here. Let's see. Someone had a question about the Forward Party. David Hinckley says, with the Forward rising and Democrats expecting a big year, do you see a collision coming? I really don't. I don't know how the Forward Party... I have trouble with your premise that the Forward Party is rising. They only have a seat in the legislature because Daniel Thatcher switched his party registration. That's the only reason they have a seat, and it is more likely than not that that seat is going to swing back to Republican in November, and hard. I think Emily Buss is going to have a really hard time hanging onto that seat. Yes, Andrew Yang came to town. I did have an interview with him. I still need to publish that. I'll probably publish it tomorrow. I have to publish it tomorrow because I'm heading down to Phoenix at the end of the week to go see Bruce Springsteen, and I'm pretty excited about that. But yes, but I do have trouble with your premise that the Forward Party is rising. I just don't see it. They got some attention, but I really think that it's more likely than not that seat, Senate District 11, swings back to the Republican Party and hard. John Notwell, former state legislator, he really wants back up on the Hill, and he's got a lot of support from Republican leadership for it. Danny J on TikTok says, so frustrating how loud money talks in our political landscape. Well, thanks, Citizens United. But yeah, you need to have the resources to run. There's no public funding of campaigns at the federal level. And here in Utah, you know, we have some of the loosest regulations for corporations. Corporations, there's no limits on what they can give, and there's no limits on how much an individual can give a candidate from the state level on down here. Now, there are some regulations from cities here and there, but when you look at the legislature, when you look at state level races, governor, lieutenant governor, treasurer, attorney general, our campaign finance rules are pretty much, you know, extremely lax, for better or for worse. But you get a lot of, you do get a lot of money flowing into these races. Katie Did It says it was Reeby's district that pulled the Proposition 4 signature removal effort across the finish line. Yes, they were the one, that was the district that finally dropped them below the race or below the threshold and knocked Prop 4 off the ballot, which really, I think, impacts what the Republicans want to do in this election. They were really counting on having that on the ballot to motivate their voters to get to the ballot, because they are going to have that forthcoming constitutional amendment that will allow them to repeal any voter-passed initiative. And so they were counting on the Prop 4 repeal being on the ballot to bring their voters to the polls. I don't know how much that changes their calculations, but I think it will change their calculations going forward. Let's see. Gabriel on YouTube says you need to pass stuff for your constituents unless you are Bluin or Lee. Well, yeah, Bluin pulled off. He pulled off a stunning upset. He really did. It wasn't stunning. A lot of people could see it coming. He beat Gene Davis, the Democrat who was there forever. And Davis wanted one more term in the Senate, and Bluin saw his opportunity. I mean, the district went like by 50% for Davis, and Davis was mired in scandal at the time. Bluin saw his opportunity and jumped and won that seat. As I've said before, a lot of politics is about timing. A lot of this is about timing. Nelson Knight on TikTok says, who are the likely candidates to replace Mike Lee if he were nominated to the Supreme Court? That's the question on everybody's mind. I don't think anybody knows, because as I said, our process is that the legislature is going to pick 3 Republicans and send those names to the governor. The House and the Senate will have to decide on those 3 names. And as I said, the political knife fight that would come to that, the political knife fight that would come out of that is going to be amazing. If Senator Lee were to be nominated for the Supreme Court, if he were to be tapped for the Supreme Court and be confirmed. The political knife fight on the Hill to be one of those three names that is sent up to the governor. It's not completely up to Spencer Cox. The House and the Senate will pick three Republican names to send to the governor. And I think that is going to be one of the most exquisite things to watch, if indeed that were to ever happen. Kathy says, do I have to request a ballot to vote in the primary? How do I do that exactly? It depends on what your registration is. If you are an independent, I think you have to go to the county clerk and request. The information is probably on their website. If you're a Republican, you certainly have to request a Democratic ballot. And if you are a Democrat, you automatically will get that ballot mailed to you. So that's how that will work. Speaking of Mike Lee, I don't know, this kind of passed, and I tried to write something about it, but it was just so weird. On Sunday, when Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, was overwhelmingly defeated in his re-election bid in Hungary, Senator Lee on his social media, on the word vomit that is his social media, the constant word vomiting, floated whether the United States should offer asylum to Orban, which is insane. And it was, he got mocked pretty hard on social media for saying, should Viktor Orban be offered asylum in the U.S.? And my favorite reply was from the writer Pedro Gonzalez, who wrote, asylum from what? Hungarians? Why are you such a dumbass? How do you not drown when it rains and you look up at the sky? How did someone as stupid as you get into political office? It's just this it's stream of consciousness on Senator Lee's social media. And people have spent a lot of time trying to break down what it was. People have spent a lot of time looking at his posts. It's brainworms. It really is. It is Fox News brainworms. Gabriel says, with respect to the three names for a Senate nomination, what is there to watch? Wouldn't they make the decision in their caucus meetings behind closed doors before coming out to make a speedy vote? Probably. And that's where the politicking is going to be. But that's going to leak out because you're going to have a lot of people making promises and campaigning and politicking for this position. So yeah, I mean, it's going to be really interesting to watch if indeed this happens. I don't know if it will, but that's how the process would play out, that the legislature would get to pick. And yes, most of the decisions would be made in their caucus, but the vote would have to be on the floor. And, this is not the kind of thing where people are going to take being told no lightly. And this is the process that a lot of Republicans have dreamed of, because they talk about abolishing the 17th Amendment, which provided for the direct election of senators by the people. In the past, it was the legislatures that picked the senators because that's how they were held accountable. So this is that process playing out, and they would send it to the governor. One person says they'll send their favorite and two candidates they know the governor won't pick. Probably. But I think it would be really hard for them to do that, because I think that there's several people who would really want that position. And again, it's going to be hard for them to tell people no. And I don't think people will take being told no lightly, because this will be the easiest. You won't have to spend millions of dollars to get elected to the Senate. 71 on YouTube says a run by Henderson would be awesome. I think she might be thinking about running for governor in 2028. There's a lot of people who are trying to position themselves. Jason Chaffetz, obviously. And I say this and people scoff, but Jason Chaffetz and Deidre Henderson would probably be the initial front runners for governor in 2028. They've got name recognition. That's the biggest piece of this. Jason Chaffetz is extremely well known. He's on Fox News. He has best-selling books. He's got a great gig. He's raising a lot of money, or putting a lot of money away to possibly run for the governor. And Henderson, she's got a lot of name recognition, and I think she's getting a lot of goodwill from voters right now. Her problem would be winning the Republican nomination. She clearly would have to get signatures because the delegates absolutely hate her, and it would be very hard for her to get nominated through the convention. But I think that she would be one of the front runners there. SJ says, I would prefer Henderson if there's no other option, like someone viable on the left. There's not going to be someone viable on the left. As we started off talking about my race ratings, the Republican baseline in the state is 64.5%. Democrats, it's really hard for them to win a statewide race. They haven't done it since, I think the last one was Jan Graham in, was it 96 maybe? It's been decades since Democrats. The close, and there's a reason why, and again, this is part of that, this is part of the calculation in the Ben McAdams race. There's a lot of anger among some Democrats about McAdams leading the charge for the party to sit out the 2022 race to allow Evan McMullin to run against Mike Lee head-to-head with no Democrat in the race. Say what you will about that strategy, but it was the closest Senate race in Utah in several decades, within 10 points. And I've said this before. There was a point with about 3 weeks left in the race that it looked like Evan McMullin was going to win. Even Mike Lee's people thought that Evan McMullin was going to win. That's why Evan McMullin went on Tucker Carlson's show on Fox News and begged, and literally begged Mitt Romney to endorse him, because he thought he was going to lose. They were freaking out. So yeah, the Democrats are mad that they were going to sit out the race. But if they had nominated someone, that candidate would have lost to Lee by 30 points, 20, 30 points, easy. Lee wants the Democrats to nominate someone against him because it's an easy win for him. Because Democrats, they have a very damaged brand in Utah. Things are changing a little bit, but it's a very damaged brand, and voters default to the Republican candidate. Barbara Bunka Brower says, why do delegates hate Henderson? Many reasons. One, she's associated with Spencer Cox and the Phil Lyman wing of the Republican delegates, the Phil Lyman wing of the Republican Party. They hate Spencer Cox. They don't like Deidre Henderson. She would have a very difficult time with delegates at the state convention. JK7771 says Utah Democrats just need to position themselves to do well when a federal realignment takes place with how nationalized politics is at this point. Republicans, they're very worried that Utah is going to turn purple. And demographics are shifting against them, but demographics are not destiny. And that's the thing. A friend of mine, Mike Madrid, who wrote a very great book called The Latino Century. And Mike Madrid he's a former Republican strategist. He was the political director for the California Republican Party. He was one of the people who started the Lincoln Project. He's a never Trumper. Now he's an independent. Very, very smart guy. He wrote a great book called The Latino Century about how Latinos are going to shape our politics in the next century because, we're on the way to becoming a minority majority country. But to assume that Latinos are just going to vote for Democrats is looking at everything wrong. That's what happened in 2024. Latino men broke for Donald Trump. And a lot of Democrats were scratching their heads. But you cannot just assume that they're going to vote for you. You have to put in the work. You have to identify with those candidates. Now, that's not as much of a problem here in Utah because we are still an overwhelmingly white state. But the minority population is growing, not at a huge rate, but it is growing. I don't know how much that's going to impact elections, but even then, you still have to communicate with those voters. You have to find ways to communicate with them. You have to find ways to and suggest policies that will attract them to your side. Sherry SLC says Henderson can use a signature strategy and she'd get a lot of signatures from independents and Democrats. Not if she's running as a Republican. If you're running as a Republican, you need to get signatures from Republicans. If you are running as a Democrat, you need to get signatures from registered Democrats. Those are the rules. You cannot have independents. It has to be someone who can vote in your primary. So if she's going to run as a Republican, she has to get Republicans because only Republicans can vote in the primary. So she wouldn't be able to do that. Okay, last thing, a story I wrote this morning. If you'll remember, I've been talking about this rule that the state Republican Party passed that said you have to be registered as a Republican for a year if you want to run for office. Previously, the Salt Lake County Democratic Party was using that rule to knock out Trina Christensen, who is running for state school board. Trina Christensen has not been a Republican for a year. And they initially told her that she could not run for the nomination because she had not been registered as a Republican for a year. Now, Trina Christensen was only doing the convention route, and she was unable to compete at the convention, so that would be the end of her campaign. Well, the Salt Lake County Republican Party, there's two rules on the book. There's a bylaw, and then there's a constitutional amendment talking about this. And there's a one-word difference between the bylaw and the amendment. The bylaw says the one-year registration rule applies to anyone seeking to run as a Republican candidate. But in the state constitution, it says the rule applies to a person, quote, seeking to run as a state Republican candidate. So that one-word difference, the word state, the Salt Lake County Republican Party said it doesn't apply to us. Trina Christensen can try to be a nominee. Fine. Well, even though the Salt Lake County Republican Party said that the rule did not apply to them, it does apply at the state level, and the Republicans used it to knock a congressional candidate out of the race. Retired Air Force Major General David Harris filed to run as a Republican in the 3rd Congressional District. His resume is very impressive. If you look at his website, his resume is very, very impressive. But he was informed last month that he was ineligible to compete at the Republican convention because he had not been registered as a Republican for a full year before jumping into the race. Now, he said the reason he did that is when he was promoted to senior leadership in the Air Force, he switched his party affiliation. He had been a Republican his entire life, switched his party affiliation to independent to avoid any appearance of partisanship. And then when he decided to run, he filed back as a Republican. Well, they said, our rule says you need to be registered for a full year, so you can't participate at a convention. Well, he was collecting signatures as well, but on Friday, he realized he wasn't going to have enough signatures, so he dropped out of the race. He was not allowed to compete at convention, but he and wasn't going to be able to get the signatures. So this rule, they are enforcing it at the state level, and they knock a candidate out of the race in the same race that features Celeste Malloy and Phil Lyman. Speaking of Phil Lyman, this is something I'm working on a story on, and I'll tell you about it here. But yesterday was the deadline for federal candidates to file their disclosures ahead of the convention. If you're running for Congress, you have to file a disclosure ahead of the convention. The quarterly deadline is the 15th, but the pre-convention deadline was the 13th. And everybody filed, except for Phil Lyman. I texted him today and said, hey, why didn't you file? He said, it's due on the 15th. I said, no. That's the quarterly. Since you're running, you have to file your pre-convention disclosure. So he missed that deadline. Doesn't bode well for his race. I'm sure he'll get a fine of some sort, probably not a big one, but it's an oversight that's not great for Phil Lyman. He missed that deadline. Let's see. Looking through the comments, probably going to be ending here in a minute, talking for about an hour and a half. I really appreciate your time tonight. Thank you so much for joining me on this. I'm glad we could talk about some of these issues. Like I said, I am planning on being at the Davis County Republican Convention on this coming Saturday. If you're there, come find me. I will have stickers. I can hand those out. I handed out quite a few of those at the Salt Lake County Democratic Convention. Come by, say hi. I'll give you one of my stickers. We can chat about politics or whatever, but I will be there. As I said earlier, I do have some sources within the Davis County Republican Party who say that the leadership is very worried that I'm going to be there. I'm glad that they're a little bit scared of me. They should be. The media is an adversarial relationship. I'm not there to be a stenographer. Stenography is not journalism. But I expect some interesting things to happen at that. Elliot Nutter, last thing. Any thoughts on Trump's attack on the Pope AI post? I feel Utahns would be primed to be tuned into that since the state esteems its own church leaders, is familiar enough with Jesus to know that wasn't a doctor's outfit, but honestly, I haven't seen much commentary. It was so offensive. It was so blasphemous. And I think John Curtis was the only one who's really said anything about it, about, how blasphemous it was for Trump to post that AI slop. And it wasn't even original. He repurposed a post. The original post was different a little bit. You can spot some differences in the background. I don't have time to go into it, but it was pretty offensive. When I saw it, my jaw hit the ground. But it's just, it's par for the course. It's par for the course. And the way that my colleagues in the media are treating this is so astonishing to me, because if Barack Obama had done anything like this, even a tenth of this, if Joe Biden had acted a fool on social media like the current president does, the media, Republicans, they would be storming the White House to get rid of him. But here it's just like, whatever. What are you going to do? And it's really alarming. It is really alarming. And that's all I'm going to say about that. I think the media's response to it has been very, very lacking. It's left me wanting, because if they had the kind of scrutiny on Trump that they did because of that they did on Joe Biden, where they diagnosed the man constantly, it's really, really disappointing. R. Callum on Instagram says, I rarely visit Truth Social because but I had to check and make sure that post was real. It's so bad. I actually have an alert set up on Truth Social every time the president posts, just in case he says something, he endorses somebody or whatever. But I've got an alert, so I see it on my phone. That's the kind of sacrifice I'm willing to make for you, the audience. But yes, I always check to see. Lady of the Great Salt Lake says, why are they, she's talking about the Davis County Republican Party. Why are they so worried about you in particular? Because I write things that hurt their feelings. I remember, I am the reason why the Republican State Central Committee no longer allows media to attend their meetings. I used to go to all of their meetings whenever I could. I would go there. I'd sit in the back. I'd take notes. I'd write about it on social media. I remember once I hurt the feelings of one of the attendees who was trying to get me kicked out of that meeting. But I am the reason why they wrote a rule that says the media is no longer allowed in their meetings, which I don't blame them. I'm kind of disappointed because there was always a good story that came out of it. Like always, there was a good story. But I don't blame them. I wouldn't want me in that meeting either. And I'd be wary of me coming to that convention. But apparently I write things that hurt their feelings. I'm not going to stop. That's what I do. Anyway, that's enough for tonight. This Tuesday evening. That's enough for tonight. I'll be at the Davis County Republican Convention on Saturday. If you see me, come by and say hi. I'd love to talk with you for a few minutes. Ask me for a sticker. I'll give you one of those. I'm planning on being at the Republican State Convention a week later on April 25th. That's down at Utah Valley University. there will be no newsletters on Thursday or Friday this week. I'm going down to Phoenix to go see Bruce Springsteen on the Land of Hope and Dreams tour, and I am extremely excited. Why am I excited? Because he's playing my favorite song of his on this tour. I've never seen him do it live. It's Ghost of Tom Joad. That is my favorite Springsteen song of all time. I'm so excited about that. Tom Morello from Rage Against the Machine is part of this tour as well. They just broke out a cover of the Clash's Clampdown that they've played on the last two shows. I hope they play it on Thursday night because that's amazing. But I'm so excited about this show. But that's where I will be on Thursday. So I'm very excited for that. And as I've said before, all the MAGA people who are upset about Bruce Springsteen being so political have never, ever listened to his lyrics. So anyway, last pitch for my stuff. I am an independent journalist. I am supported by my readers. That's it. I'm supported by you. I don't have corporations. I don't have billionaires telling me what to write, throwing me money, and then controlling what goes out on my platform. But that means that I have to rely on my readers to keep doing what I'm doing. You can go to utahpolitics.news and you can sign up for my newsletter. That's free. Almost all of my journalism is free. If you want some extra stuff like my exclusive race ratings for all 75 House races and 15 Senate races on the ballot this year, you can sign up. It's $5 a month or $55 for the full year. You also get a few other extras there as well. Or you can throw some money in the tip jar. That's also on my website, utahpolitics.news. Head over there, sign up. If you feel like it, throw some money in the tip jar. Every little bit helps, allows me to keep doing what I'm doing, free from the influence of corporations, political agendas, billionaires who control our media. It's so important, and I can keep coming and doing these lives and talking to you about what is happening in Utah politics. We'll be back with another show next week. Again, thank you so much for your time and attention. And I really appreciate it. I appreciate you spending some time with me on this Tuesday evening. And we will talk at you later. Everybody have a great evening and peace. Love you.